we're now going to have a presentation on migration in historical perspective. So this is going to be very exciting. Thank you so very much for coming today.
Thank you. In my scholarly work, I've done a lot of research on really more contemporary activism, Arab American activism, and the whole kind of creation of this category that we call Arab American. And I've done that in comparison with British Arabs and British Arab politics. And looked, at these two different contexts where these Arab identities develop and form, and how they're important and how they remain linked to the Arab world in various ways. So I've got a lot of background in researching those kinds of issues. But what I'm going to focus on here is a lot more general, and I thought it would be useful just to try to put Lebanese migration in some kind of perspective. So that you can see the way that Lebanese migration is it's very unique, but at the same time it's not an isolated event. It's very linked in with a lot of other processes that were going on that tie together migrations from all over the world. And so I'm going to try to give you a little bit of perspective on that, so you understand the way that the Lebanese community here in Georgetown kind of fits in with these bigger patterns going on. And some of the earlier talks have touched on some of these issues and looking at the Ottoman Empire. And hopefully this will fill in some of those details a little bit. So the thing to keep in mind is that the migration, and for those of you in the room who are Lebanese American and who are from Georgetown or from wherever you happen to be from, where your ancestors came from and where those migrations started, they came out of this global economy that was developing, from the 1600s onward, but really kind of picking up pace in the mid-19th century. So all this migration that came from Mount Lebanon in the 19th century, which is, again, for the community in Georgetown and elsewhere in South Carolina, where you talk about Lebanese immigrants from Mount Lebanon, this was an era of massive labor mobility that really actually surpasses the kinds of labor mobility that we see today, at least in terms of the percentage of the population that was on the move. So again, this period of really massive labor mobility lasted from about the mid-19th century to the eve of the First World War, about 1914. And but it really stems from an even earlier period where this process of globalization, a European-centered globalization, came out of the 16th century. And what's important to realize here is that this was not the first globalization, and I think that Reem made this point earlier today, is that when we talk about this sort of globalization, this wasn't the first globalization. There had been globalizations before, but they were centered in the East. They were really centered around China and around the Arab, we call the Arab world today, and Persia. They were in the East. And then the kind of balance of power in the global economy really shifted in the West after the 16th century, but it took a long time. So our story is really starting in this period. So what were some of these processes? Like what was going on in the 19th century? And what was underlying these migration patterns that we know about very intimately? Now, and there's a few kind of key features to this. I'm not going to go in great detail about all of these, but just very briefly, if we look at the 19th century, what was happening in this European-centered global economy that was developing? The first thing to talk about really is that it was based around colonialism and empire. And there had been empires before. China was an empire, there were Arab empires, right? So there were lots of empires before. But just in terms of the sheer scale of territorial control and resource extraction, European-centered globalization was really quite amazing and very intensive. So you get a globalization that's really built on the formation of empires with the metropoles in Europe. And it's built around raw resources and the creation of markets. And we'll get to the raw resources in a second here. Because the raw resources were needed to fuel industrialization. So after the kind of late 1700s, the kind of economy that was developing in Europe was an industrial economy. It was built on powered machinery, large-scale mass production that was, you know, it had external power associated with it. So first water power and then coal power. So that kind of industrialization, this large-scale industrialization, standardized goods for large-scale consumer markets, it required enormous amounts of raw resources, and those resources were coming from colonies. That's what was driving this desire for colonies and colonization, was to fuel this industrial economy. And with industrialization also, this need for these raw commodities, it was creating these enormous shifts in agriculture. So you get a shift from subsistence agriculture, where people are producing in sort of subsistence farming for kind of local consumption and maybe local markets, but a lot of just sort of food for sustaining yourself. And a shift away from that to what we call commodity agriculture, where you're having to, you're producing things that are for sale on the market, on a large market, global markets. That was in turn related to urbanization, because as you're shifting production away from subsistence, you start to release people from the land. People are no longer producing for subsistence. They no longer have access to land because production is changing, it's becoming larger scale. So a lot of peasants are being displaced from land, and they're therefore moving into cities where they're finding work in factories, right? Or they're going overseas, as we're going to see. So it creates these patterns of urbanization. Those are also related to population growth, because populations start to grow under industrialization. And then finally, what was ideologically really tying together this global economy in the 19th century was liberalism. So this was a whole ideological framework that supported free trade in quotation marks. So it was called free trade as long as the British, you know, wanted it. Then it was free trade. So you have free trade and then free movement of labor. And so these are all really important, because before this time, most kingdoms and empires restricted emigration. So there were usually tight controls on movement of people. You know, you'd find seasonal migration patterns, not to say that nobody ever moved. People did move. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, in the 18th century as well, a lot of kingdoms in Europe, they would restrict people's ability to move. China restrict people's ability to move. The Ottoman Empire initially restricted movement outside of its territories. So there's a big change that takes place in the 19th century, the late 19th century, which is this free movement of people, relatively free movement. Okay, so what you start to see developing with all those things, all those processes that I just mentioned, they're all interacting with each other, they're all interrelated. And, you know, in the 19th century, the mid to late 19th century, this creates these major patterns of free labor migration. And I'm emphasizing free here because in the 18th century, of course, there had been massive labor needs, because you started to see sugar and, you know, indigo and other commodity products earlier in the 18th century, right? And we know that from American history and from the Caribbean. And of course, that wasn't free labor, that was slave labor. So that was one of our first forms of mass migration, mass labor migration, was slave labor. Once slave labor is, you know, there's the abolition of slavery and it's no longer viewed as morally acceptable or economically viable, and you get a shift to free labor systems. And there's these huge demands for labor because of commodity agriculture, which requires a lot of labor, and because of industrialization, which requires a lot of labor. So you need a lot of labor movement, and this is all free labor after the mid-19th century. So you see these massive patterns of labor migration developing. Some of those are taking place within Europe. So for those of you in the room who are of Irish descent, right? Anyone from Irish descent? I know we've got at least one, okay. You start to see these patterns, what are called periphery to core patterns, where people from these more peripheral parts of Europe are moving into areas of more dynamic industrial growth going on. So the Irish moving to Britain was an important migration flow at the time. You had Italians moving to France. You had Poles going into Germany to work. So there was all this kind of movement within Europe, huge flows of people. It's involved millions of people. You had colonial migrations, where you had people from Europe moving to the colonies, places that they colonized. So for instance, you have people from Britain moving into Canada. You have people from Britain moving into Australia. You have Europeans, and especially French and Swiss, moving to Algeria, 1 million of them between 1830 and maybe 1930, right? About 1 million Europeans were living in North Africa, right, in Algeria. You have lots of Brits moving to Kenya and to Rhodesia, right, Zimbabwe. So a lot of those migrations. And then another flow, and you can see how diverse these flows are, right? Another one involved indentured labor movements. And this is where you had the British disrupting agriculture, disrupting local industries in India, taking control, in my view, looting India, essentially. You had masses of impoverished people in Uttar Pradesh and other parts of India and Bengal, and they became basically a labor force for British plantations in the Indian Ocean and in the Caribbean. So once they eliminated slave labor, you needed new kinds of labor, and the British found workers in India, and there were millions of these workers from India who went all over to work after the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean to work on plantations, right? And that's a picture of Indian workers from maybe Andhra Pradesh. I can't remember Uttar or Andhra Pradesh to work in these plantations. And then, of course, a story that we're familiar with in the United States, which is transatlantic migration. Now, how many people in this room trace their ancestry to transatlantic migrations from about mid-century, about let's say 1850 to, whenever? How many of you trace your ancestry to that time from European migrations? Okay, so quite a few of us in the room. So this was, an enormous period of enormous migration, mostly from Europe, across the Atlantic. And again, free migration. So there was obviously a slave trade that was transatlantic. This was free labor migration. So from 1860 to the eve of the First World War, you had about 52 million people leaving Europe. And most of those went to the United States, but many of those also went to South America, as I'll look at here in just a second. And all of this flow, these flows of workers, it was all being facilitated by faster and cheaper transportation. It wasn't caused by transportation. The transportation facilitated it. Transportation got much cheaper, much faster, much safer. You had large-scale recruitment taking place. You had the railroad companies in on it. You had the steamship companies in on it. And then you had much more communication going back over the ocean, going the other way, encouraging family members and friends to also come, causing these chain migration patterns. So, as the cost went down, it became a lot easier to migrate, and then more and more people were migrating. They were fulfilling these really important labor needs in the Western Hemisphere. This is all related to the rise of the United States as an industrial power in the late 19th century. So the U.S., had been sort of, a bit of a backwater in some respects, right? It always, it had importance producing, cotton and various other things for this Atlantic economy. But as an industrial power, it really starts to rival Britain and then Germany in the 1860s, 1870s. And it really rises as a major industrial power very quickly. And this is at the same time that America is expanding westward and into what had been seen, as a wilderness, as an unpopulated wilderness, although of course it had been, fairly thickly populated with Native Americans. And, for America at that time, part of becoming a nation, part of achieving greatness was about westward expansion, was about colonizing and taking control over that continent. So you needed population, you wanted people to come in order to populate the West. So, and there were so many resources to take advantage of, agricultural resources, mining resources, all kinds of things. So that really paved the way to massive migration. And migration was relatively open at that time. Remember, this was under a liberal labor migration regime where there were few restrictions placed on the movement of people. So there was very little in the way of any kind of migration control. The concept of an illegal immigrant was pretty much non-existent. So when people tell you, well, my family came here in 1900 and they came legally, they weren't illegal immigrants. Well, yeah, because nobody was really an illegal immigrant unless you were Chinese, and I'll get to that in a minute, right? So gradually what you see at this time was migration shifting. The way where people were coming from was shifting from northwestern Europe to southern and eastern Europe, and also to a smaller extent the Ottoman Empire. And this was a quite different movement because many of the people who were coming, in these later migrations were Jews and Catholics, which raised a lot of questions about assimilation and how these people from these kinds of, sketchy, sort of dodgy places and religious beliefs and what at that time were viewed as racial differences were going to fit into this, what was viewed as a quote-unquote Anglo-Teutonic society, an Anglo-Teutonic Protestant society. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I just wanted you to get a sense of what the scale of these migrations were. So, when you sort of look around 1880, and then especially between 1900 and the beginning of the First World War, those numbers, these are in the millions. That y-axis is in the millions. So, the numbers were getting up around 2.5 million people a year in some cases, and certainly over 1.5 million in many years. And if you compare that to today, we've had for the last maybe 20, 25 years, fairly sustained immigration at around 1 million people, 1 million legal immigrants per year settling in the United States. So these flows were quite massive, and this was at a time when population numbers were quite a bit lower than they are today. Nonetheless, as a percentage of the population, because it was in such a compressed period of time that the flows were that high, at the height of it, around 15% of the US population was foreign born, which is about where it is today. A little bit less today. So you're talking about, a pretty good chunk of the American population was foreign born because of these flows. Do you all have any questions so far about this, or is this, I'm kind of moving through it very quickly, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of it. We don't want to forget about other parts of the Western Hemisphere, though, because places like Argentina and Brazil were also attracting a lot of immigrants. And in fact, proportionally speaking, and possibly also in absolute numbers, I don't have the facts and figures in front of me, South America attracted many more Lebanese people from Mount Lebanon than did the United States. So there were sizable numbers in Argentina, and at this time, Argentina was really booming, not so much because of the heavy industry the way the United States was, but because they had this agro-pastoralist economy that was based on cattle and sheep and the production of wool for the European market, for Belgium and France. The British, they had a large woolen industry, but they were being supplied by New Zealand and Australia. So they were feeding into a different market in Europe. And when you started getting refrigerated shipping, they could ship fresh meat to Europe, and Argentina really boomed. There was also industry, but not quite at the scale that you find in the United States. So if you look at, the 1940 census in Argentina, the percentages are even higher than you find in most U.S. states at this time. In some of these places, higher than 40%, more than 40% of the population would have been European-born. Not even counting the Ottoman, right? People from the Ottoman Empire. So it's just, they're starting from a very small base, right? They only had something like 500,000 people when they became independent in 1810. So they had a very tiny population. So, you're talking about a small base, but, the country is really as much as European settler society as we are, if not more so. And most of those were coming from Spain and Italy. And this just gives you, this is a nice, I won't dwell on this for too long, but just to kind of give you a sense of cumulative European immigration by destination between 1820 and 1932. So if you look at the kind of 60-odd million Europeans, and you can just see, the way that the United States really dominated everything. I mean, there was nothing coming close to what you'd see in the United States and the number of European immigrants who came to the U.S. But Argentina was second, so it was a pretty impressive immigration figures. And the other odd one that you look at is Cuba, right? And a lot of these were Spanish immigrants. A lot of people were leaving Spain at that time and going to Cuba and Uruguay and Argentina and even Brazil, Spanish and Portuguese. Okay, so what was going on in the Ottoman Empire at this time? Because I've been talking mostly about European immigrants, right, and European immigration. But the Ottoman Empire was also very much kind of tied into the same set of processes. And it was affected in similar, but distinctive ways as well. So how were these changes felt in the Eastern Mediterranean? So, you remember from some of those maps that we saw earlier in the day today that the Levant and the Balkans and Asia Minor and North Africa were at least nominally under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Really from the kind of the 1500s and then certainly in the 19th century, at least under the nominal control of the Ottomans, which of course was centered in Constantinople or Istanbul. Which was the former seat of Byzantium, the part of the Byzantine Empire. And the Ottomans had long had important connections with Europe. So the Ottomans for a long time had been allied with France against the Habsburg Empire. So in the 1500s and 1600s, the Ottomans perennially were allied with the French. So there were these long-standing relationships between the Ottomans and the French. So these were not isolated, these were not isolated empires by any stretch of the imagination, right? They were very kind of woven together. And the French, they had a lot of commercial interests, and they had this influence with the Ottomans. And as Europe became increasingly powerful, the French were increasingly exercising that power over the Ottoman Empire and gaining more and more influence and power. And they did that, it was first the French, but then later on it was other, the Dutch were involved and the British and other European powers. They started to gain a lot more commercial influence because their power in Europe was becoming much, much more pronounced. Globally at this point. So what you start to see is the Europeans negotiating trade concessions with the Ottomans in the 19th century, around the 1830s and 1840s, and they gained another number of different commercial privileges and concessions. They had, breaks on taxes. They didn't have to pay the same sorts of tariffs. They had legal jurisdiction over their own communities. And they had, all kinds of powers, basically, and they sort of ran almost independently, and yet they created these very mixed, interconnected communities within these Ottoman port cities, where you had, these European consulates and embassies and such. So there were a number of these port cities that emerged in the Mediterranean that became these real we think of these cosmopolitan, very mixed in terms of religion and nationality, and they all kind of communicated with a common language. There was literally the lingua franca, which was sort of a simplified Italian language that they used in these port cities. And Beirut was one of these cities. We also see Alexandria in northern Egypt. And then Smyrna, which is today Izmir in Turkey. So these were important centers of this cosmopolitan, mixed European, Ottoman culture. And increasingly, they had more of a hand politically. European powers were gaining a lot of political control and power over the Ottomans in the places where they were operating. And this becomes very clear in Beirut, where Europeans became very powerful politically in Beirut, and then in the hinterland of Beirut, in Mount Lebanon itself. And then adding into the mix was the large numbers of missionaries that entered into these places. And I'm going to get to the missionaries again later on, because it's kind of linking in with some of the stuff Matthew was talking about with this exoticizing of food and then this imagery of, I think a lot of that was coming from these, early on was coming from missionaries and the dispatches missionaries would be sending back to the U.S. And these missionaries were coming from all over. Some of them were Catholic, French Catholic, and many of them that were Protestant, and Presbyterians and so on, Americans and British and so on, going into this region. So Mount Lebanon was one of these places where Europeans were very deeply involved in all kinds of political intrigues. I'm not going to, Beirut had really been, in the 1840s, had really been transformed from this kind of backwater. It was really a sleepy, very small, I think there were only like 6,000 people there in the early 19th century. And it becomes this really kind of bustling port, in the mid-1800s, kind of 1850s, 1860s, filled with foreign merchants and missionaries and lots of kind of very mixed in terms of religion and nationalities and so on. And the influence of the French was felt way beyond Beirut, though. It was also in Mount Lebanon. And I can't really get into the details here, but over time, the French and other European powers had sort of gained control over Mount Lebanon, and they had, there had been sort of civil conflict between the Druze and the Christians, and it had led to this massacre in the right around 1860 or 1861, and that gave a perfect excuse for Europeans to come in and basically impose sort of a separate government on Mount Lebanon, which they did. But the Maronite Christians had been the protégés of the French for a long time before that. So there had been these connections for a long time between the Maronite patriarchs and the French and the Catholic Church. And an interesting irony here is that the French at this time, in the mid-19th century, there was incredible anti-clericalism. They were very, in wanting to get control and beat down the Catholic Church. But when it came to the colonies, they were all for Catholic, Catholic everything, getting missionaries and, kind of nurturing this Maronite Catholic Church and so on. And where we see a lot of this influence is in the development of silk agriculture, sericulture. So the production of silk cocoons to supply the European silk industry that was based in Lyon in France. So they become a major supplier, the Lebanese. And I think that there had been like a long craft history of the production of silk in Mount Lebanon, but it really went to a different scale. And Akhtar Khater has written beautifully about this history of French, the French involvement in the sericulture and its links to migration. Now by maybe the 1890s, early 1900s, the silk production had started to decline. The price that these Lebanese peasants could get for their silk was declining. But by that point, they had had a taste of prosperity in the mountain. They had had a taste of disposable income and consumerism. And then remember, all this new stuff is happening in Beirut, and that stuff is filtering up to the mountain, where people are, they're eating more sugar and coffee and these sort of luxury goods and things that were sort of, these modern tastes that people were becoming more familiar with them because of all the changes happening in the Eastern Mediterranean at this time. And of course, the Christians are the ones who have these connections with the French. Some of them had education, they had more money, they had the expectations, so they were the ones who migrated, right? They were the ones who had the wherewithal to migrate. Generally, when you talk about global migration, it is rarely the poorest, most isolated communities who migrate, right? When you look at migration and who migrates, it's mostly places that are seeing development in some way. Where things are undergoing a level of transformation. It's not the poorest places, it's not the isolated places. It's places like this and people who are being affected by it, right? So that's really what's going on here. So it's the Christians who have been tied into the global economy through the silk industry and the relationships with France. And they're the ones who start to migrate in large numbers. So again, where are they going? They're going to South America and to North America. They're going to both of these places. And again, these are the places with the expanding economies, with the industry, places that were open to settlers, and that's where they're going. And, in the United States, they were referred to as Syrians because Mount Lebanon hadn't completely taken shape yet at this point, so they were generally referred to as Syrians. In South America, they were often referred to as Turcos, right? So they were the Turks. And at that time, and I think even today, they're one of the largest ethnic groups in Argentina, and also in Brazil. So they were being absorbed, we've already heard a couple times today, a lot of them were being absorbed into the industrial economy in the northeast of the United States. So there's been some really interesting oral histories and story mapping projects about what they would call the Syrian community in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, and these mill towns up in the northeast, where they were an important part of the industrial labor market, and also in Dearborn and in the Ford factory. And then we also see the pattern that we've talked about today with peddling and small merchants, shopkeepers, grocers, restaurateurs, all that kind of stuff. And often going into places where there weren't a lot of immigrants. And I'm going to show you some numbers here in a second. And there was a significant amount of return migration. And again, Akram has written really some interesting stuff about the influence of return migrants on Lebanese society and on this sort of ideas about modernity and gender relations and so on. So there's a very interesting story there that I don't have time to get into. That's a picture from Argentina. Okay, so looking in the Deep South, right? What I want everybody here to recognize, and I don't know how well you can see those numbers, is just how low foreign immigration was in the Deep South. So at the time, at that height, remember those big spikes I showed you, right, of immigration to the United States, when on average, in the United States as a whole, about 15% of the population was foreign born. And you look at the Deep South, and you see that's not 5%, that's 0.5% of the population in South Carolina in 1880 was foreign born. And you compare that to Massachusetts, which had a very active industrial economy and a lot of factories and so on, where it was about a quarter of the population was foreign born. So the South, then you look at North Carolina, 0.3%, and in 1890, 0.2%. So you're talking about a few thousand people, very small numbers of people. These were small communities, and this was not a place where there were lots of immigrants, right? These were very, very small communities of immigrants, so they would have stood out. One would imagine that you really would have stood out as a foreigner in a place like Georgetown, right? Mississippi is another one. And what's really interesting also is that these numbers were actually lower than they were before the Civil War. So some of you may know, if you ever go to Columbia, you'll see there's a big old Catholic church there, St. Peter's Catholic Church, that was maybe from around 1840, 1850. That's because they had brought a number of Irish and German laborers in because there wasn't enough slave labor to build the canal, right? So then you started to get some of this Irish and German labor and so on. But that was before the Civil War. It's even lower after the Civil War. And these immigrants were coming into a society that was dominated by the 1890s at least, by Jim Crow segregation. And very low levels of, there was industrialization, there were mills and mill towns in the South, especially after the 1890s, a lot of textile production came here, but relatively low levels of industrialization. And that's partly what explains why there were so few immigrants. Immigrants were not going to come to a place where there was a large, a black underclass, low-paid workers. There was just not a lot of mobility here. But the Lebanese saw opportunity, right? In this very sort of rigid society. Sometimes some scholars, sociologists will often refer to the Lebanese and Jews and other groups, and they call them middlemen minority, where they're sort of between the two main groups, and they kind of carve out a niche in those groups, and they become the sorts of grocers and the small shopkeepers, and they're in this somewhat ambiguous position, and very much in a racially ambiguous position here in the South in the late 19th century.
Ask,
Yeah.
what was the north of, I hate to make fun of North Dakota. What was the north of
Oh,
Dakota?
yeah. Okay, I put that in there on purpose. So remember when I said part of what was happening in the U.S. was industrialization, and part of it was westward expansion.
Yeah.
So the Dakotas were part of the westward expansion. So they were basically opening, the U.S. federal government was opening up land for settlers. And these were our Scandinavians. This is your people,
Yes.
right? So these would have been the Swedes, and this is my husband's family from, the eastern Montana, farmers and stuff that came out.
It's a large number, yeah.
Yeah, so but remember, it's like Argentina. It's starting from they hardly have any people living there today. So that's 6% of like maybe 200,000, so it's a small number, but it was there just to give you a sense of what was drawing immigrants, and those things were not drawing immigrants to the South, So, and so we get to this period of restrictionism in the U.S. So remember, we have this open migration system, a relatively, this liberal system of immigration where there's very little in the way of controls on people coming in. There were a few things that they would exclude you from, but really very few people who showed up in Ellis Island or in New Orleans or wherever, very few were actually turned away as a percentage. But that really starts to change in the 1920s, and this is after 15 or 20 years or more of debate in the Congress. I think it was called the Dillingham Commission in 1905, which was all about the kind of the changing racial makeup of the United States and what that, how that boded for the future of the country. And the country was completely, and we could still say still is completely race obsessed. And ideas about race were somewhat different then than they are today. We have a very binary conception of race. Back then, there were lots of gradations of race. And lots of different ways. We often use the word ethnicity today, and oftentimes back then they would refer to those as races. And things like eugenics were very, very popular, like crazy popular. It was not some fringe, crazy, loony movement out there. Eugenics was core to debates in American society about assimilation, about the future of the country, about whether immigration was a good or a bad thing. These were all based on eugenic arguments, and about whether having all these Catholic and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe were racially polluting, whether they were bringing down this sort of Anglo-Saxon, or what they'd often call Anglo-Teutonic stock. And a lot of these debates were being led by the Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite in the country, although at this time there were also voices of dissent as, relatively small numbers of Jews, especially from the Northeast, found their way into Congress and were often on the opposite side. And there were liberals as well at the time who were opposed to these restrictions. But this really was the dominant voice, and it's really what led up by the 1920s to what they called these national origins quotas, which basically restricted it's sort of a long story about how they worked it out, but it basically brought the numbers of admission way, way down to what they had been based on numbers from like 30 years before this. It's kind of a long story. I can explain it if you want to know. So there was a lot of very kind of deep anti-Catholic sentiment in the country at this time, and particularly anti-Semitic attitudes at this time. Now, with that said, there were some people who were hopeful about immigration and who had a more positive spin on it. Like I said, some of these Jewish congressmen, there were also these sort of progressive types in the Congress and active at the municipal level and city governments and so on. And some of you might have heard about settlement houses. And these were very popular in the Northeast and the big cities, big industrial cities, places like Chicago, where you have, often run by women, often run by Protestant women, but women who kind of felt like if you just showed these sort of backward people the way, they could become good American citizens. So their argument, it was both anti-racist, but also very paternalistic at the same time. And there was this view that we're going to have these we're going to show people how to be good Americans. We can sort of Americanize them. And again, it was sort of paternalistic, but far less racist than you'd see with the people in the eugenics movement. So there were these other voices out there that were much less, that were trying to kind of temper some of this anti-immigrant hysteria going on. But at the end of the day, the anti-immigrant hysteria kind of won out. And, starting in the 1880s, you had Asian exclusion. So Chinese were basically excluded from immigrating by around 1882. And eventually, they were also denied the right to naturalize as American citizens. And that was on the books in the United States until 1947, right? Where they could not naturalize. And it's really because of Asian exclusion that the Lebanese had an issue. Because the question was whether the Lebanese were Asians, right? That was what was at stake. Because Lebanon is in Asia, it's in southwestern Asia. So geographically speaking, the Lebanese were Asian. But the question was whether they were part of the Caucasian race, despite geographically being in southwestern Asia. So that was really the question. So that was really coming from Asian exclusion. And the issue had to do with naturalizing, whether an immigrant could become a citizen, right? Here's the weird thing though. The children born in the United States would automatically be citizens. And that was established even for Chinese immigrants. And that was a Supreme Court case, I can't remember when, in the early 1900s, that said, no, if you're born in the United States, you're an American citizen. Interesting. But you could see how the stakes were really raised about Asian exclusion and keeping Asians out so that they would then be producing American citizens on American soil, basically. So you had to kind of exclude them completely from immigration. So that was really what was at issue here. And a lot of those cases, the major one with George Dow was fought in the South Carolina Supreme Court. So those were in the South. Some of those debates were in the South, but they were everywhere. The South did not have a lockhold on racism in the United States. This eugenics stuff was everywhere. It wasn't sort of a Southern thing. So it was all over the place. So that's what this question of whether they were white, whether they were part of this Caucasian race. And then that, I'm sorry?
Who brought that suit, do you know?
This was George Dow, was his name.
And he was?
He was a Syrian American. Yeah, he was from, I think it was first brought in Charleston, and then it was in Columbia in the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. But, this is what mobilized a lot of these, I think one of the earlier talks this morning mentioned how it sort of galvanized and mobilized Syrian American activism. It was around this issue. And so you get people from other parts of the Syrian community, and it shows up in the newspapers, and the Syrian newspapers, about this kind of fighting for their whiteness. They had to become white. And what's so interesting is to look at the language that was used and the way that the Syrians community, they did, again, that land of the Bible is so important. because that was the language Protestants understood, was this language of the Bible and the Bible people, right? And so they were drawing on that to say, we're Jesus people. And what's so interesting at this time is the way that Jesus was always portrayed as being white. Like white, not like a Palestinian, which he was, a little swarthy maybe, but portrayed as like he was German or Swedish or something, right? So there was and these ideas about American nationhood and Christianity and whiteness were so kind of closely linked, right? So they basically have to say, we're Caucasians from the land of Jesus, we're like Jesus, we're the same people, so this was important. And, what I want to suggest though is that, like I said, a lot of this made sense to Protestants, and this was something I've kind of stumbled upon recently, is that, you get this racial ambiguity, you get a lot of this really, there are, and Akram has pulled up some of these newspaper articles, like things from Mississippi and so on, where they're talking about the Syrians as these kind of, who are these dirty people, who are these kind of strange foreign people coming here, these very kind of disparaging terms describing these Syrian immigrants coming in. And yet there's also this incredibly romanticized imagery of these people coming from the land of Jesus. And a lot of that, I think, was being fed, and this is just a theory, and I'm just playing around with this idea right now, but I think it was being fed by Protestant missionaries. And these Protestant missionaries were coming back and they were writing about it. And what I noticed when for a totally unrelated reason, I was looking through these old newspapers. Every town in South Carolina had its own newspaper, right? But they were often drawing on articles from all over the place. Like they had syndicated articles, and they'd draw on it. You'd see, like in the tagline, they'd say, "This article originally came from this paper in Florida or this paper in New York," or So there was this whole other print culture that we're not really familiar with anymore, right? And but they would have like sermons on the front page of the newspaper. They'd have like several columns where this one guy, I can't remember his name, but he was a pastor who would give these sermons, and his sermons would be on the front page of the paper. And they were always about places in the Bible. He would always be talking, and I think he had been there. He must have been a missionary because he would talk about these places. And so there was this very, very evocative language about the land of the Bible. And I'm just going to finish up by showing you all, these are some of these articles I found. And these are all small town newspapers from about 1880 to about, 1920, right? And there's lots of these articles. And I just kind of pulled a couple of them. And what was going on at this time as well was, of course, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the kind of wresting of control over for the remains of the Ottoman Empire by the French and the British, right? And eventually that led to I think the mandates were imposed around 1920 or 1922, is that right, where the mandates officially started? But the French and the British were already there, right? And what's so interesting in this language that you see is this notion of the people of Mount Lebanon and the Levant, the kind of Eastern Mediterranean, as being these victims of Turkish and sometimes Muslim oppression. But sometimes it gets a little bit more mixed up. Here, and the title of the article, is this the one? Yeah, okay, we'll suppress Turks. So this is all, during the First World War. The Syrians are full of hope that the war will release them forever from the thraldom of the Turks and will bring contentment to Christian and Mohammedan alike. To no class has the proclamation of a protectorate over Egypt. Oh, this must have been earlier. Protectorate over Egypt, that was like 1882. So this might have been even, or 1885 maybe. This might have been earlier. I'm sorry I didn't include the date on it for some stupid reason. Many of whom have found it impossible to live in their own country owing to Ottoman extortion and brutality. It will have secured happiness to one of the most law-abiding people in the world. Interesting language, right? So very different than, you get so many weird, different, very disparate ways of talking about people from the Arab world at this time. One was the most law-abiding people of the world. I thought that was really funny. So that was, then this one is another one, a similar one. This one is of interest to the Christian public. And I think they meant the Christian public in America when they, I couldn't tell, but of interest to the Christian public. European powers' decision to grant effectual and permanent protection to Syrian Christians against Mohammedan oppression, noted by Lord Melbourne. So Lord Melbourne, I think, was the kind of, I think he was the Prime Minister when Queen Victoria was young, maybe, yeah, although it must have been like, because that was like 18, I don't know exactly when this was. But these measures to protect the Syrian Christians and their forms of worship. Oh, and noted by Lord Melbourne, in considering measures to protect Christian Syrians, that their forms of worship much resemble those of the Church of England. Hilarious, isn't it? Right? So this is all in the, and you can see on the bottom of it that it's coming from something else. So they were reprinting articles from elsewhere, or from magazines and things, and these things would show up in these local newspapers in these little towns in South Carolina, places like Camden and Georgetown, right? And then this one, I think, was either a traveler or a missionary. And, this is writing about, how beautiful Syria is. And they talk about, going into these valleys and seeing all these amazing beauties, and they just rave, and they go on and on and on. This is just a tiny snippet of it. This article goes on and on about just how absolutely beautiful it is. But then also this kind of touch of the exotic, because then they're pointing out the harems, right? They've got these, where in wealthier families, women would have been, secluded behind screens in the home. And so they kind of, they're always sort of pointing out these harems in the area. So, you're getting these, again, small town newspapers. So they talk about it as how the river is bringing fertility and prosperity and health. Right? Oops. This one, I do have the date on. This is from 1900 in Edgefield. This one was hilarious. It's hilarious in hindsight. Not so hilarious, really. This article was this is a long article. This was like half of a page, half of a broadsheet, right? And it's about the Druze and how strange they are. And it's, it has and like what I don't show you, the pictures of their women and pictures of the priests and pictures of the, the people and how kind of exotic and strange they are. So they have all these sorts of illustrations. And these are all being, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a report from a Dr. Max Oppenheim, a distinguished European scientist and scholar, recently completed one of the most remarkable journeys ever undertaken to the East. So these are, he comes back, this, probably German professor and scientist, and he comes back and he talks all about his journeys and all about these strange people, the Druze. And parts of it are actually quite, in a very Orientalist way, talking about this strange yet very interesting religion that's combining Christianity and Judaism and Mohammedanism, whatever they would call it at the time. And it's this very kind of interesting language that's used to describe people. And then occasionally, you'd probably see this more in the papers, maybe in New York, I would guess, I'm not sure. But this was a story that appeared, it was not a local story, it was coming from New York, I think. But it was, again, reprinted in this paper in the South. It was about a story about this, a case of a Syrian immigrant who sues the father of his prospective bride because she basically, they kind of renege on the marriage agreement. And it's this big, long story. And again, they talk about, it seems, it's like quaint and exotic and strange. And they talk about the, following the custom of that prevails in his native land. So they sort of talk about it here, about the way that these marriage matters were being debated according to the old country custom, right, in the New World. And so these stories are making it into the press. It's very, very interesting. Oh, and this is the last one, which is just kind of entertaining. I found this one interesting, and I'm not really sure what to make of it, but somebody had written this had been reprinted from another article. An author, someone wrote in, a guy named Albert Rhodes, in Appleton's Journal. It was reprinted in this newspaper, which is criticizing the way that we think about Jesus as white. Very interesting, because this would have really resonated. This would have really ruffled, this would have really ticked a few people off, I think, if they read this, right? The Christ of painters is blue-eyed and golden hair, and such a one never existed save in their imagination. A blonde in the race of Syrian Jews is unknown. Painters think blue eyes more spiritual than dark, and golden hair more godlike than black, and the Jewish typeface ignoble, which may stem from the degradation to which the race was forced for so many centuries by persecuting Christians. I was sort of like, very, very kind of gutsy to, and I wonder how who made the editorial choice to put that in this newspaper from Conway or, wherever this one was from. So I think a lot of sort of interesting parallels we can draw to today, as we get, larger and more diverse populations of Arab Americans, many of whom are Muslim, many coming from poorer backgrounds in poorer countries like Yemen. And these kinds of things help us to think about, well, how are we describing people? And how do we today represent them and think about them? And what are the parallels? What are the debates? How are we thinking about assimilation? How are we thinking about the ability of different groups to become part of our nation and part of the American nation? So these debates are still going on today. They're changing, but they're still there. So I'm hoping that this kind of maybe gets you to think about all these processes and the way that they're at work in our own society today. So thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
So thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I was especially interested in the way that you spoke about race. And as you were speaking about the numbers of migration, the numbers are much higher, as you noted, in South America.
Yeah.
And when you look at South America as compared to the United States, in the way that there's been more of more visibility, I think, for Syrian and Lebanese in Latin America, to the point that you have presidents
Yes.
of many Latin American countries who are of Syrian and Lebanese origin.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could just speak a little more to that, or maybe, I don't know, your perspective on how race functions differently in South America versus the United States.
Yeah, that's a super interesting, so interesting is that question that I've been planning for years now to write a Fulbright proposal to go to Chile and research exactly that question. And I think, I think it's very interesting because I think in a lot of ways the Lebanese Christians from my family's generation, we did essentially enter that privileged realm of whiteness. So I think something similar has happened in South America, but I don't know the mechanisms by which it happened. And I don't know exactly, I know in race is a very kind of complicated thing in Brazil. In Argentina, they do have Afro-Argentinian populations, but much smaller. And so I don't really know exactly what the dynamics were there and how it differed from what happened in the US. But I do think that, Lebanese Christians in particular, because of all these processes, and I think because they've been able to sort of negotiate some of those things, and they did kind of, they became white. The same way that Italians did and others. And a lot of that was really at the expense of blacks. And a lot of that happened, you know, in that period of time when immigration was cut off. There was this need to kind of mobilize people for the war effort in World War II, and you know, you couldn't kind of, everyone had to be American, you know, this kind of overriding nationalism, but it didn't really apply to African Americans. But, you know, but yet it created this glue, this kind of racial glue. So that, I think that was sort of the dynamic that was happening in the US, and I don't know exactly how it happened in South America. Yeah.
It's a great question.
It's a great question, and very
Do
understudied.
you think that it could be possible that, you know, in the United States, Syrian and Lebanese were too brown, so they had to keep, versus they were whiter than some of the inhabitants of Brazil, for example, and so there they could be the white, like,
Yeah,
you know,
that might have been some of
ascendant,
it.
more powerful.
But think that in this country, we didn't have a Catholic president until 1960,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
there were
forget about
times.
white and black and red and
Yeah.
just a Catholic, we didn't have.
I think that's part, because the Anglo-Saxon hostility to Catholics was pretty significant. So I think, you know, whereas in you know, they fit right in with the Spaniards and Argentinians, you know, and Italians and Portuguese. So I think that might have been part of it. I think they more easily were able to kind of blend into that.
Just speculation, I think probably the Lebanese in South America became wealthier much faster, and as you know, they were there before other communities started becoming wealthy, whereas in the States, the Anglo-Saxons were already wealthy and powerful and had
The ruling class.
Yeah, I mean, they were very much like a ruling class.
right.
And yeah, clinging on desperately, right? But it's but yeah, I mean, I think that they're just, now what's interesting though is that the Argentinians and others, the Peruvians and all of them, they desperately wanted Anglo-Saxon immigration. Like because they were all saying the same eugenic thinking was there as well, where they said we need to basically, there's a term in Spanish, it's like, you know, blanquear, you know, to make white. They wanted to whiten their populations. And especially in places like Peru, where they had large indigenous, you know, Indio populations, and they wanted Europeans, but they wanted Northern Europeans. And they had a little bit of success. There's a fairly large German community in Guatemala, and there were Welsh in Argentina, and Germans and Swiss. You know, there was a fairly large Swiss community that went to Argentina. They desperately wanted to whiten their populations because they felt that would give them a stronger nation. But in the end of the day, you know, what they got were Italians, Syrians, and Spaniards. You know, that's what they got. So, you know.
Yes, sir.
There's a book by Alexa Mouth that I read a long time ago, Becoming American. And I don't know how, this is not a critique of her or anything, I don't know how scholarly or based on actual numbers this was, but if my memory might be failing me, but I remember something about her arguing that the Lebanese immigrants and Syrians at the time were much less likely to want to work in factories. They were more sort of, I mean, that's a stereotyping.
I think it's I think that's a misconception. Because I think if you go to places like Massachusetts and New York, I think a lot of them are working in factories.
I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, I think that's a romantic. I mean, I think it's true that they were disproportionately shop owners and things like that, but I think there were big chunks of the community that were wage workers in factories. I think that's.
Or it might be just a sample of people she happened to.
Yeah, but I think in the South, they were shopkeepers. You know, there was industry, but most of the industry was textiles, and they were typically drawing rural whites, rural poor whites. They almost totally excluded African Americans in the factories in the South.
Another May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So all of this biblical imagery that's associated with Syrian and Lebanese Christians, how did that compare to the Jew and the sort of the biblical kind of imagery associated with that? I mean,
Yeah.
were they separate or?
I don't think the Jews were quite as successful. I don't think they were able to. And I think part of it is like when you read, what was I reading? It was some of the language from one of these court cases where they were basically saying Jesus was a Jew, so Jews were from here, blah, blah. And they would say, no, but the Jews here, they're European Jews. And so they were not viewed as like really biblical. They were viewed as kind of this, kind of mongrel, European outsider group. But I don't think that, I think maybe sometimes it did, like in some contexts it would, but I don't think it worked as well as it did for the Syrian Christians. But that, I don't have a lot of proof, I don't have a lot of evidence for
Yeah,
that.
the early Jews in America, especially here in South Carolina, who were from England.
Yes.
So they were treated as, European for that part, not Jews from over in Palestine.
Yeah. And I don't know in this country whether, in the Northeast, most of the Jews were Ashkenazic, and so they would have been Yiddish and German speaking and so on. And, I don't know if they would have been able to capitalize on describing themselves as Mizrahi Jews, Jews who had been, from the Arab world and things like that. And I think there was a different dynamic, but I have a feeling that they weren't able to capitalize on it as much.
Maybe they weren't even interested.
And maybe they weren't interested. Yeah.
The kind of reminds me of the Ibrahim Rahbani, who was a Catholic. I guess he was a Maronite, but he converted to Protestantism after immigrating to the States. And he made a huge name for himself by claiming that he could understand the Bible in a way that nobody else could because he was from that land. And, so not only restaurants and music, it's like we see this in so many different areas. It's something that's really been brought out to me in the last few.
And it's very fraught now. Because some of the stuff I'm looking at now has to do with the involvement of evangelical churches in the South on the Syrian refugee crisis. And so there's a lot of very interesting dynamics there as well, because some evangelical communities have typically taken positions that are very antithetical to with Palestine because of their support for Israel, and this very kind of ultra-Zionist perspective that's really put them at odds with, some Middle Eastern Christian and Muslim communities. But at the same time, some of them have been very outspoken in supporting Syrian refugees. So you see that it's very multivocal. There's not, I think there's usually a dominant voice, but there's other voices. And you see that in these news, even then, there wasn't a single narrative. There were lots of narratives. And what I find very interesting, and I think what's kind of, and I regret so much I got into these things when my grandmothers were very old, and I never really got to ask them what they thought about this stuff. But what's interesting is then how people encountered that, and how on an everyday basis they used it or bristled against it or played on it, or how did people react to those different ways that they were being objectified and talked about, which I find really interesting. So yeah.
You mentioned the court case trying to prove whiteness as opposed to Orientalness or Asianness. But did you come across cases where you had Lebanese trying to prove their whiteness as against Africanness or blackness?
No, because that was never in question.
Okay.
So that was never brought up. There was always especially in the South, there were very clear rules about what made you black. And so that was never really an issue. It was more about being Asian. And that, you know, was from this 1882 Asian exclusion. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? You know, Akram, thank you so much.
Yeah.